Hey everyone, I'm Ray Belli, and this is Words for Granted, a podcast that looks at how words change over time. If you value this podcast as a free educational resource, you can support the show and get access to past bonus episodes by making a monthly donation at patreon.com/wordsforgranted. Thanks to Justin and Camilla for their recent contributions. If Patreon's not your thing, but you still want to support the podcast, you can make a one-time donation at paypal.me/wordsforgranted. All right, let's get on to today's episode. An awesome discussion about grammatical gender with linguist and linguistics blogger Danny Bate. Well, Danny, thank you for taking the time to join us here on Words for Granted.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me, Ray. I'm extremely flattered, and I only hope I can provide some good content for your audience.
I'm sure you will. But before we get on to the main topic of today's discussion, which is grammatical gender, tell us a little bit about your current work and how you got there. Like, what's your trajectory within the field of linguistics been?
Yeah, I love this question. I love asking it to people because like no two stories within linguistics are the same. I'm sure you found this. My story in particular, I was sort of vaguely aware of what linguistics was. I knew that it sounded pretty good when I was about 17 or 18 and applying for university in the UK. I got to start an undergrad degree at the University of York in England, and my suspicions and my hopes for linguistics were immediately confirmed. Like, this is for me. Since then I can never see myself really studying anything else. So since that BA, I then did a master's degree, and I'm currently a PhD student at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. So I've migrated north. And my specific, my specialism, my obsession, would perhaps be a better word, would be historical syntax. So that's looking at things like word order, like agreement, various things that you might call grammar, and how they develop and change over time. All parts of language. Language is certainly, it doesn't stay still. And what I like to work on is really taking languages that are the earliest languages in the historical record. You know, we're right on the edge of the documented, of the known, and pushing that into the unknown. So taking languages, comparing them, seeing where they come from, and in a word, reconstructing them. So where did languages like English and German come from, and how come they're so similar? Stuff like that. So in a word, historical syntax. I zeroed in on this particular field very gradually. I think, again, I'm sure you've had this before, where people slowly realize that there is a field within the intersection of their interests. So I liked syntax and I liked very old languages. Why not study them together? So that's me.
Yeah, no, I think that's awesome. As I think most of my audience knows, I'm not a professional linguist. I talk about linguistics and I talk to real linguists, but I think had I pursued that academic path myself, I probably would have wound up sort of in a similar subfield as you, just because simply I love the very old languages. I love the sort of emergence of written records, and sort of speculating on what came just before that. Do you have particular languages that you focus on? They mostly Indo-European languages, I assume.
hmm Absolutely, yes. So Indo-European is very much my family. I have the odd flirtations with other families, and I'm trying to, break out of the Indo-European. But that's just little hobbies that keep me going. The day job is absolutely the Indo-European family. Specifically, my like considered in the long perspective, my whole PhD thesis is aiming to reconstruct the original or the ancestral syntax of the Indo-European family. So, as I'm sure your listeners are familiar with, there's this hypothetical language. We call it Proto-Indo-European. And despite the fact that we will never have direct evidence for this language until someone invents a time machine, we can know in a strange sense of the word, meaning of the word know, quite a lot about this language. So we know, for example, that we know a fair amount about its sounds. We know a fair amount about its lexicon, about the culture and people who presumably spoke it. But I have a feeling that the syntax, the things like the word order of this language, and reconstructing that based on the oldest documented daughter languages, which are the ones I study. It's about a set of about 7 or 8 of them. Um, I feel like that's something like a final frontier for Indo-European linguistics. I'm sure better Indo-Europeanists would disagree with that, but they might agree and they might share my impression that there's a lot of pessimism about syntactic reconstruction. There's a kind of sense, there's some brilliant Indo-Europeanist scholars who've thought, no, this is not possible. Sounds are fine. We can reconstruct sounds. They're concrete. But word order? Whereas I'm perhaps one of a maybe new cohort of people who are a bit more optimistic. We think we really can reconstruct something that we can be confident about and say, yeah, this probably happened.
So you're part of this new wave of Indo-Europeanists that is uh, optimistic syntactic reconstructionists. Is that right?
I like it. Yes, absolutely. The optimists, perhaps. Being part of a new wave sounds very, very grand. I don't feel like I'm part of a new wave in that I feel like there's about 5 of us. But
I mean, hey,
sure.
hey, for the field of Indo-European, that's a solid number, right?
It's not a bad number, isn't it?
Yeah.
And obviously, with talking to good people such as yourself and great podcasts like this, maybe I can get the word out. And I don't know, maybe the 6th member of our team is out there listening somewhere.
Well, I sure do hope so. I'm going to take this stupid hat off. I keep on bunking into my microphone stand. One second.
You'll be all right.
Okay, so wonderful. Let's jump in to sort of the meat of our discussion here, which is about grammatical gender. So, probably, I'm going to say most people listening to this podcast know what grammatical gender is, but I wanted you to give us a technical definition of gender.
hmm with great pleasure, and with some trepidation because it is a really big topic. So, gender from one point of view, from an introductory point of view, and what people most might be most familiar with, is that gender is a feature that some nouns have in some languages. English, as a rule, does not have grammatical gender, whereas French, Spanish, German, other European languages do. And from one point of view, it's simply like a set or a way of dividing all the nouns that a language might have. And they all have a value, or they all have one kind of this feature gender. They belong to one of these genders. But that in itself is maybe we could do with a stronger definition, because that, for example, that definition could apply to declensions, which is another kind of grammatical phenomenon that people may be familiar with and may fear if they've done, some Latin or some Greek. And declensions and gender are not the same thing. If I can quote someone, there is a very good and a very kind of strong definition of gender that improves on this, which is the definition from the 1950s of Charles Hockett, a linguist. And his definition of gender is that genders are classes of words reflected in the behavior of associated words. So, what that kind of means is that rather than being something that only nouns have, it's something that nouns share with their dependent words. So, take for example, imagine that English had grammatical gender. A nice long noun phrase, so a phrase that includes the noun and dependent words, like some big blue American cars, where cars is the noun. All the words in this phrase, in a language with grammatical gender, would share in the gender of the noun. It would be sort of percolate its way through the whole phrase. And that particular phenomenon we call agreement. All these items agree. as it were. So I think that's a much more kind of robust idea, because gender really is something. If the dependent associated words, if your adjectives and your quantifiers and determiners, all the things that we add to our nouns, if they don't show gender, they don't show the same feature, it's not really a gender. That's not. It's more like it's just something the noun has. It's something that doesn't really matter.
Sure. And now this again might be a very basic question that most people listening already know, but how is gender represented and expressed in a word?
That's a really good point. So, dealing with spoken languages, I say here, I'm in Europe. European languages, it tends to be the endings of words. So there'll be something, a little word, could be a sound, could be several sounds on the end of all these words. So, to give an example from German, something like die kleine deutsche Frau, the small German woman. And the Kleine and the Deutsche each have just a little vowel at the end of them that tells you that they are feminine, like Frau. Interestingly, the noun itself has nothing on the end. Frau doesn't have this ending. I think it did once upon a time, but it's not necessary today. What matters is that the adjectives have it. But that's not the only way that gender can be shown. You can have it on the beginnings of words. So, very famously, a very big, very populous language of Africa, which is Swahili. Swahili has several noun classes. They tend not to be called genders, but there's a distinction. I can see why linguists of African languages might prefer noun classes, but it's a similar phenomenon. And in Swahili, it's at the beginning of a word. So the first couple of sounds will change, and this will change. All the associated words will also show this agreement with the same words. Closer to home for me, in the UK, we have Welsh, where during like the very extremely distinct and really quite unique changes that make Welsh Welsh, it's the first consonant and the changes to the first consonant that can show what gender it is. So there's many different ways that, in spoken languages at least, gender can make its presence felt.
Awesome. And now, I mean, I suppose gender is what we call this in English. It's a confusing term, perhaps. I mean, as you're describing, the characteristics of gender, it seems to me like the word category can just work just as well as gender, because when we think gender, of course, the first thing that comes to mind is human gender, male, female, and of course that does sort of graft onto the way we describe certain nouns as masculine or feminine in some languages. But I sort of want you to sort of break down or elucidate the arbitrariness of the concept of that word itself, gender, and the fact that we call some nouns masculine and some nouns feminine. A lot of listeners of the show have written me emails or asked me, like, why masculine, why feminine, and like I don't really have a great answer other than they're just these categories, and I always put it in quotes. So yeah, is there anything you want to sort of say about this arbitrariness of the word gender and masculine and feminine?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, your listeners are asking the right questions, good and difficult questions as well, because untangling grammatical gender and human gender is challenging. I mean, we have to take a huge history-long view to kind of pick them apart. I don't think, first off, it's right to say that these two uses of the word, these two concepts, are completely separate. And I'm talking here about European languages. That's not to say they are one and the same, and you're absolutely right. The arbitrariness. I'm sure your listeners might have sat through a Spanish or a French lesson, and you think, okay, right, a man is masculine and a woman is feminine, but a chair is feminine, a car is feminine, but a tree is masculine. I mean,
Sure. I mean, I'm thinking of an example. I don't remember what language it's in, but the word for bra is masculine, for example. Or like I know, like it's in Spanish, vestido, dress, is masculine as well. So like these things don't entirely make sense when correlated to their quote unquote human gender.
Absolutely not. There's all sorts of factors, and the meaning of the word is just one of them. So sometimes, yes, you can say, yeah, sometimes, okay, there's this new word's developing, and it has some sort of association with human gender. A lot of the time, no. And a lot of the times, it's more, other factors are more powerful, more stronger in determining what the gender of a word ends up being. So a well-known example would be in German Mädchen, which is the word for girl. Girl is certainly, in human terms, is a word with a pretty gendered, but it's neuter in German. It's neither masculine nor feminine. It's neuter. Same also across the border in Czech. Děvče, which is quite a traditional word for girl, is also neuter, whereas other words for girl are feminine, as you might expect. So the arbitrariness is absolutely kind of embedded in it. It's yeah, it's hard to kind of entangle them and piece together. Personally, I would just go right to the source of the problem, and to say, start with blame the Romans, basically. The word gender comes from Latin genus, which can mean like a type, very non-specific, just type or kind of something. And in languages since then, languages which have used the word, like French, genre and then gender in English have just, the two meanings that we're talking about here go back to the same word, which is extremely non-committed to what kind of types we're talking about here. I
Yeah,
think that's a
exactly,
great deal of
exactly.
confusion. Yeah, it comes from there. But in terms of why masculine, feminine, neuter, firstly, that's very. It's by no means a global division of languages. So in I mentioned Swahili, for example. Swahili has 9 or 18 noun classes, depending on how you want to count them. And men and women do feature, but it's more like they're divided to humans, animals, plants, locations, that sort of thing. There's a very famous example, the Jedabal, the Australian Aboriginal language, most famously has a feminine gender, but it includes women, I think women, water, things to do with fire, and things to do with like violence and poison. So clearly, that's nothing to do with society. There's nothing in that culture that would justify this on the basis of meaning. So within European languages, it's a tricky one. It's certainly old. I will say that much. There's this division of the genders, masculine, feminine, neuter. In English in English concepts, it goes back to Latin, and the Romans seem to have got it from Greek, from the Greeks, like so much in Roman culture. That's not to say that Greeks are the only source of this idea. I do believe, for example, in Sanskrit, which is the same, it's part of the same language family, but it's geographically very distant. Sanskrit is an ancient language of India. I do believe they have the same concepts. So I think the word for gender is linga, and then there's the masculine linga, the feminine linga, and the sexless linga. So clearly, there's people are people are it's a hard question to answer. It's a hard one to kind of really zoom in on one particular factor. But if I had to put it very vaguely, I would say it's people looking at their language, looking at their society, and maybe taking the divisions of one and applying them fairly crudely to the other. In the case of taking a big division, or a big at least societal division, and applying it to language, and not really minding if it doesn't completely work.
Sure. So let me see if I'm understanding what you're saying. So basically, early, I mean, I guess let's call them proto linguists or pre linguists, are looking at language and observing certain features in nouns, and how they behave, and they say, okay, we have. I'm going to stick with the word category. We have this category, that category, and then another category. And what I'm going to do in order to like sort of classify or categorize these nouns is I'm going to take this very obvious categorization or classification from my society and just slap them on to language, even though they're very different and they really don't have any intrinsic or inherent connection. This is just one sort of classification system, and boom, I'm going to put it on this other thing, language.
Yeah, there you go. That is the kind of the only hesitant theory that I might want to suggest for at least where the terminology comes from. That being said, again, bringing it back to specifically the Indo-European languages, like I said, these two types of gender we're talking about here, they are closely intertwined, and we might get onto this in a second if you like. But there is when the kind of the three-way system of genders that I mentioned that is very common in European languages, so masculine, feminine, and neuter, when we believe that all got started, definitely an element of it was human gender or sex, one of the two. I'm not saying it was the only factor, but there was certainly gender at that early point in linguistic history, in linguistic history. Um, the gender was perhaps a bit more meaningful. Like essentially in Indo-European languages today, gender is, you could say, it's meaningless. Like it doesn't really add something to the meaning of the word, in most cases at least. In its early stages, when that three-way system is getting started, I think historical linguists think that human gender and sex was a contributing factor, and making something feminine had a much stronger connection to societal femininity. Let's put it that
Mm-hmm.
way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
Um, okay, now I'm going to hit you with three pretty big questions, and I'm just going to say them up front so I don't
Okay.
forget. So I don't forget them, and then we'll tackle them individually. So the first one is, how common is gender in global languages? You don't have to tell me specifically, just broadly. The second question is, why do you think gender sort of naturally emerged in unrelated languages? And then lastly, what is the practical function of gender? So these are sort of like a one after the other. So let's go back to the first question, which is oh god, what was what was the first question? Oh, how common
Like
how how
common, yeah,
common
common.
is gender in languages?
Mhm. I mean, it's a huge question, and you're going to have to ask a real linguistic typologist for for their opinions on this, because it's a big one. The only sensible answer I can give, and the answer I stand by, is that all of your listeners should go and check out WALS, which is the World Atlas of Language Structures. It's a freely available resource online, and you can just play around with the maps. WALS, WALS, and play around with the maps, and look for different grammatical features. You can waste a lot of time on that website. And I've had a look at it before for things like gender, and I can say at least that gender is certainly not confined to Europe. It's not confined to, Eurasia versus Africa and the Americas. It is something that can emerge and has emerged globally. That being said, many language families that where the ancestral language a long time ago did not have gender have preserved that to this day. So we've got things like the Turkic language family, which includes things like Turkmen and Turkish, unsurprisingly, and they don't have gender at all. Similarly, the Finno-Ugric languages, so that's things like Hungarian, Estonian, Finnish, also do not have grammatical gender. I believe Hungarian, at least, does not even have gender in the pronouns. He, she, it. It's just It's just It doesn't change. So I would say that it's definitely a global phenomenon, but it's also by no means a universal phenomenon, if that makes sense. There really are huge language families that just don't have it.
Got it. Okay, and now the second question in my three-part question is, oh my god, uh, what the hell did I ask you? My second question was,
There's a slight difference. It was like, well, what is the point
oh,
of it, or how did
oh,
it get?
oh, no,
Yeah.
that was question three. Question two was, how, why or how did genders emerge in the first place? Is there sort of a theory for their emergence, which I suppose is connected to my third question, which is, what is their practical function?
Sure. Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, you do have to take it on a language by language basis or language family by language family basis. Genders are something that, as I mentioned, they are global, and that's it should come as no surprise with that distribution that it doesn't take that much for genders to get started. Again, thinking in a massive global perspective. What it tends to be is that we have this process where you might call grammaticalization, where something that starts off as a very meaningful word, for example, in the case of gender, it could be a word for man, it could be a word for woman, sort of loses that meaningfulness and in time becomes like a little bit of grammar, like an ending on the end of a word. That in itself, purely from a theoretical point of view, is not that unusual, not that difficult to imagine happening. It's plausible, and I think we've got some evidence that in really early stages of Indo-European, there was some sort of common word for woman that may have served as a sort of feminine gender ending that you could add it on the end. You just need working with that definition I mentioned from Hockett. All you need is just for the same thing representing gender, no matter what it is, one sound, several sounds, ending, prefix, infix, whatever you like. It just needs to be shared. It needs to be, spread across the whole noun phrase. And then, you're then only a, hop, skip, and a jump away from gender agreement. There are various reasons why that might happen, but that's maybe more to do with your third question. But in terms of it, as a historical linguist, I can say that it's not that strange that gender should keep occurring. We don't need much. We don't need many steps for a language to develop a gender system. Thinking off the top of my head, most of the examples are, Indo-European. But I'm thinking, for example, perhaps of Welsh, where the way, at least, that modern Welsh shows gender on adjectives is really quite unique. It's not through endings, and it's not, it doesn't look like, well, so much of Welsh doesn't fit the kind of general Indo-European pattern. So that would be an example of how a new system of marking gender can quite naturally evolve.
Mm. And as for question three, and then we can move on, which is what is its practical function? I mean, I was thinking about this, and I think the classic example is disambiguation for antecedents. In and maybe you can explain what that means more for my listeners than me. I think you'll do a better job. So yeah, what is disambiguation?
Well, I would say that the way I understand this term here is that by making absolutely clear what we are talking about and linking it back to something already mentioned. If, for example, you've previously said the word it or this or that, and then you have a noun phrase without any particular gender, well, how do you know that we're talking about the same thing? That because this could lead to ambiguity.
Right. And when we have this in English, I feel like I can't think of a specific example, of course, right now off the top of my head. But I feel like in English, this happens often where because we don't have gender, we have it or that or this or these or those, and there is some lack of concrete clarity on what we're referring to, whether it's in the previous sentence or an earlier clause in the sentence. And if we had gender, where a word like it, this, that, these, or those was agreeing with an earlier noun, we would be very clear on what we are referring to.
Yes,
And so, yeah, I mean,
absolutely.
that just strikes me as the most obvious function of grammatical gender. But
No, I
maybe there's
agree.
more.
Well, no, I agree with that, and I will just only add that the sort of languages that I work with, specifically Latin, Ancient Greek, Sanskrit, these are languages with a huge amount of word order freedom. That's very much what I focus on, word order.
Ah, right. Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
yeah, yeah, again, when you have that much freedom, and I say freedom, it's not like Latin, Greek, Sanskrit, it's not like their word order is chaos. It serves very distinct purposes. So you might Latin, these languages, they like to move, for example, a particular noun phrase to the start of the clause to give it some sort of emphasis or relevance, to make it topical. That's what word order freedom allows you to do. But when you have that capacity, you do need to keep on top of ambiguity, because all of a sudden, who's referring to what, which adjectives are pairing with which. Gender is enormously helpful in these languages, to just make sure that your audience knows what's going on.
And I'll just jump in and say, in English, we avoid that by having a fairly strict word order. Yeah, I guess that's all I'll say, is that in languages where you don't have gender, I assume there's a stronger adherence or even necessity for words happening in a certain order to sort of dictate what's referring to what, and we don't sort of have that flexibility. That the presence of gender within a language sort of inherently allows that more flexible word order, which is good for poetry, I guess.
Exactly that. It is. It's good for the poets. Hence, why you have. If you've ever tackled some Latin poetry, you'll know that the Romans could just you could put any part of the clause, any part of the phrase, anywhere you like, because the agreement allows you to preserve the meaning. And for this reason, I think in the history of English, the decline of grammatical gender, because spoiler alert, English used to have grammatical gender, it does go hand in hand with the decline of grammatical cases. So English, again, like German, like Latin, used to have these cases. And when we have this much more fixed word order, as we do, not with some flexibility, but pretty fixed, these two features, they're not particularly useful anymore. They wouldn't really contribute something. So I absolutely agree. I think word order and avoiding ambiguity is a big factor in the usefulness of gender. I would only add that, and I love this question because I'm happy to kind of fly the flag for gender. I've had no end of conversations with linguists and non-linguists about learning languages with gender as an adult learner, right? I get it. Trust me, I get it. I've been through this process, and I know it sucks. But at the same time, I'm always happy to say, no, there is a reason for why this thing exists. Another thing I would only add to this is that it's through gender that we can make new words. So by changing the gender of something, that is a process of what we call derivation, and that can either create a whole new word, or that can create a slight sort of, bit of a nuanced, bit of a separation between the two. The example that comes to mind is in Italian. Right, Italian has two genders, but occasionally it has these weird sort of nouns that aren't sure what gender they are. And a nice example would be muro, which means wall, as in mural in English, and it has two possible plurals. It has muri and mura. And there is a slight nuanced definition, like they have different endings, and I think pretty sure they belong to different genders as well. And there's a slight nuance in what's going on there. So that's a practical benefit to keeping genders around. I would say that much.
Okay, let's take a quick break to hear a word from today's sponsor. Today's episode is brought to you by Lingoda. Lingoda is an online language learning school taught by professional language teachers. They offer 24/7 live classes in German, Spanish, French, and English, so you can learn according to a schedule that's convenient to you. One of the things I like best about Lingoda is that you can customize your learning experience within their curriculum. So, if you already know the basics of a language, you can skip over those very beginner classes and jump right into the part of the curriculum that suits your personal level. When I got started with their beginner Spanish course, that's exactly what I did, and I'm still in the program, and it's going great. The teachers do a really great job of getting everyone in class to speak in actual conversations, not just mundane exercises. So this time, with Black Friday coming up, Lingoda is offering Words for Granted listeners a 50% discount off the first month of any of their courses as long as you sign up for at least 12 classes a month. Just go to lingoda.com, that's lingoda.com, and enter the promo code WORDS50, WORDS50, at checkout to get 50% off your first month of any of their courses. Or you can just follow the direct link in the show notes. Again, the promo code is WORDS50 for a 50% discount off your first month of enrollment. Okay, let's get back to our discussion with Danny Bate. Well, this is a good segue into another thing I wanted to explore, which is the non-existence of gender in English today, but the fact that it once existed in Old English and tracing its decline in broad strokes. But I think we have to, as always, go back to the true beginning, or as far back as we can go. So we've been alluding to gender in Proto-Indo-European, which, of course, is where Old English ultimately comes from and where it inherited its genders from. So maybe just very quickly, very briefly, high level, what did gender in Proto-Indo-European look like?
So, when we have this hypothetical language, Indo-European, we have such a good understanding of it nowadays that we can find we have evidence for different stages within its development, which I think is really cool. You can call them like old in Proto-Indo-European and younger Proto-Indo-European. Or normally, it's people talk about core Indo-European, which is again the younger of the two stages. In the oldest stage, that we've got most likely there were two. There were two genders or two ways of categorizing nouns. And rather than anything to do with human gender or human sex, it was to do with animacy, as in animate creatures, animate beings and things, or inanimate. That's for animacy would be stuff like humans, animals, and then maybe the natural world would be the inanimate category. I can go into maybe later why we can propose this earlier stage, but that's basically, this is a very old idea. It goes back to the 19th century and Karl Bruckmann, that we have two that as time goes by become three. And what happens is that the animate splits into two. This precise reasoning for this is really debated. It's not particularly clear. And again, we're really reaching back into far history. But it seemed that out of the animate, a feminine gender developed that was marked by a particular ending or a particular vowel at the end of a word. It may come as no surprise, it was probably an R vowel. There's a strong connection and link between that vowel and the feminine gender in many Indo-European languages. And by sort of almost like by default, the remainder of the animate gender became the masculine. That's the idea. So two becomes three. The inanimate gender just keeps chugging along, becomes the neuter. That's the idea. Two become three. This three gender system is what the majority of old Indo-European languages have. So I'm talking, for example, Latin, Old English, Old Norse, Ancient Greek, Sanskrit, Old Persian, Avestan, all great languages. There's only really one family, probably the first one to branch off, that does not have three. So that basically gets us to our starting position of Old English. Old English maintains and is doing pretty well with what Proto-Indo-European has given it, what it's inherited. These three genders, masculine, feminine, neuter.
So we have arrived at Old English. We have masculine, feminine, and neuter genders. However, those start to erode. So what happens? What happens there?
Yeah, it's a huge question, and unfortunately, something from a historical point of view happens, which is the Norman Conquest, and the Norman Conquest brings with it these, the dominance of Old French, which is unfortunately does obscure a lot of the sources that we would have otherwise. So it is very much something we have to piece together with what little post Old English documents we have. I think that the takeaway point really is that all components of language contributed to this change. It's not as simply that gender can just disappear, like people will wake up and go, "Oh, I don't really feel like treating that like a feminine adjective today." It doesn't work like that. Yeah, it's more, for example, that gender is its own system, and the sounds of a language, the phonology, is another system, and the gender is represented in the sounds. A change to one is going to affect the other, as it makes sense. It's kind of so yeah. A big factor in this would be that we can see that in Old English, we can see this by scribes being pretty relaxed with how they spell the endings of words. That the endings of the crucial adjective noun endings in Old English are either syncretizing, so they're becoming one, they're becoming less distinct. That probably has a big impact on the system of case in Old English. Or alternatively, the vowels are becoming more lax and they're becoming just a schwa, they're becoming just so, hence the reason why we're seeing lots of vowels now spelt with either just A or E, and that's it. A lot of confusion, not real confusion, but a lot of muddling between the different endings. That is definitely going to have a knock-on effect on gender as a whole.
Hmm. That makes perfect sense. That relationship between sound and gender, a change in one affecting the other. I also wonder about multilingualism affecting it as well, like the fact that you have multiple people who don't fully, they're not native English speakers, but, between the Norse presence in England historically and then combined with the French presence later on, you have different groups of people learning English as a second language, and then those people, the speakers from those communities, also influencing native English itself, and sort of that cycle of influence, and how a multilingual environment might also impact and change, well, language at large, but specifically gender here.
Absolutely. I mean, that certainly is, it's sort of a kind of immediate answer and theory. And I believe, at least, that the consensus understanding of the data, so what little data we have from the Middle English sources, it does seem to start or at least accelerate in Northern England, very much in sort of the Northern England, East Midlands, possibly East Anglia as well. And that is definitely corresponds to the traditional distribution of Norse, so the
Hmm.
Vikings,
Hmm.
really.
Hmm.
So it's extremely easy, and I don't mean easy as in wrong, but easy sort of like it's a natural response to say, well, is it multilingualism? Because multilingualism, it has effects. It has extremely far-reaching effects. The only thing I would say in response to that would be the two languages you mentioned, Old French, Old Norse, they had gender. So I just feel like it would be interesting what specifically about these languages might trigger it in English. It could be something really surprising. For example, how it could come from, I don't know, fewer forms, fewer kind of possible variants of the definite article. The definite article in early Old English is much stable. It tends to be say, or that, and then a whole paradigm, as I'm sure your listeners may have seen in German, big paradigm,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And that does seem to collapse as the definite article develops and becomes obligatory. That kind of just collapses into just one form. Maybe that could be the way that Old Norse or Old French influence the language. And then once you've only got one form of the definite article, well, what's the point of keeping all the adjectives different? If you've only got one definite article, it's almost like, well, just might as well give up by this point. So,
Yeah,
yeah,
sure, sure. And I mean, I guess what I'll add to that is, kind of like you said, this is not happening at the conscious level. English speakers are not, waking up one day and saying, "Oh, yeah, look at all this change in our language. Let's shift this or let's change that." It's just sort of a natural thing that evolves over time. And I think the other thing that I'll add is, again, just restating what you've already said, is that we probably shouldn't try to look for one answer. This is not a simple question with a single clear correct output. There are almost certainly multiple factors contributing to the changes that have resulted in the English we speak today in terms of gender.
I completely agree. Yeah, it does need saying, and I wish I could just point to one particular thing, but that's just not. It's just not the way it is. It is slow. It is gradual. There are many factors that might be lost to us historical linguists again until the invention of the time travel machine. And arguably, the change is still not fully completed. There are remnants of gender in English, at least. They're
Yes,
there.
that was going to be my last question before we wrap up. So please do tell what remnants do we have?
Well, I don't know. There we have, for example, this three-way distinction: he, she, it. We don't have to have that as a language. As I mentioned, many languages, Hungarian being one, manage perfectly well without it. These are pronouns, and pronouns are not nouns. They do tend to follow their own form. They do tend to follow their own history. They're quite short, for example. English pronouns are basically the only place where the system of case endures as well. We have this difference of he, him, his, which is arguably still how the nominative, accusative, dative, genitive of Old English survives. So yeah, and there's many reasons for why pronouns might do that. They do need to be separately considered. Also, the interrogative pronouns, we have who and what. This is really, really old, and arguably it predates this two-way distinction predates the three-way distinction for nouns of
Ah,
masculine, feminine. Yeah, it's really, really old. You can see it in Latin as well. Latin has quis or quid. Ancient Greek has tis or ti. I think Sanskrit has. I think again, it's just repeating myself, but I think it's something like kiha and ki. So that's arguably still a gender distinction. And the thing I love, if I just may, about something I love about this, if your listeners are familiar with an Indo-European language, especially one that has gender and case, a fact I love about it is that the neuter, like this is like basically a universal rule. If it has case, and if it has a neuter, and if it has a difference between nominative and accusative, they'll always be the same. Neuter, nominative, accusatives are always the same endings and the same form of the word. So let's take, for example, Latin, I don't know, bellum means war. It's bellum in the nominative, bellum in the accusative. Whereas take a masculine noun, dominus, dominum, it changes. Now, here's the thing I love about it. That is a huge, huge kind of general rule that the neuter will be the same in those two cases. Can take English with our meager remnants. What does not change? You can have, for example, what is there, or that's arguably nominative, and what do you see? That's arguably accusative. But who has whom? Who changes into whom? So that really, really old kind of ending distinction that goes all the way back to the early kind of stages of animate versus inanimate, who being the animate, what being the inanimate, is still there, clinging on for dear life.
wow, yeah, that's an incredible insight.
I very happily challenge your listeners to find exceptions to this, bearing in mind it does need to be Indo-European, neuter, and have nominative accusative case. So far, I haven't found any exceptions to this rule, and I just love the fact that there's a tiny remnant of it. Who and what would be a good example, and so would be it. It does not change, so it is good. I see it. They do not change, but he, him, she, her does change
Yeah,
again. The old, animate changing, inanimate not changing is still there in English to this day. So
yeah,
yeah, little
that
stuff
is
like that.
that's totally mind blowing. And I know, like, we are very nearly close to time here. In under a minute or so, can you say why you think that is, or is that, or are there just some quirks of language that is simply the way they happen because they happen that way and then they stay that way?
I mean, I think if I went with the latter, I'd be out of a job. I need to come up with some theories for why that is. I will only say that it's probably to do with pronouns and their status of pronouns that certain things just endure in these very short, more functional words.
Mm. Well, this has been such a lovely, fun conversation. Before we sign off, tell our listeners where they can find you on the internet, and yeah, anything that you might want them to know.
I can be found virtually most of the time on Twitter. So I'm at Danny Bate 4. not a very original name. It's my name plus 4. I describe myself as a linguist and that etymology guy, not the etymology, just that. It's self-derogatory. Um, and I'm there, and I try to post little facts, stuff that I come up with, and I think people will find interesting every day or every other day. And once a month, I try to write accessible introductory posts on my blog, which are intended for everyone, and just sharing some historical linguistics goodness. Again, whatever I manage to come up with.
And the blog is
Oh, the blog is, I think it's dannybate.com. I really did not go too original.
yeah, and let me just say to my listeners, the blog is wonderful. I mean, that's sort of what made me want to have you on the show. I was reading these articles, and I think anyone who likes Words for Granted will definitely 100% enjoy Danny's blog. So yeah, well, again, thank you for coming on, and we might just have to have you back and have another discussion about something else.
What a shame! What a shame! You'll just have to have me back. I'd be delighted. I really would. I can talk about gender in other languages or whatever you like. Maybe next up Latin.
Oh, yeah, that'd be great. That's it for this one, guys. As always, I hope you loved it. Again, if you loved the show, I encourage you to leave a rating and a review wherever you listen to the podcast. And also, again, if you want to support my research and regular output of content, you can become a monthly contributor at patreon.com/wordsforgranted or make a one-time donation at paypal.me/wordsforgranted. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you next time here at Words for Granted.